Peter Lamb.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I very much welcome, as I'm sure do most of my colleagues on these benches, the Government's actions so far on Commonhold and leasehold, and I look forward to further steps emerging. Today I'd like to speak on the issue of property management agents and particularly in the context of unadopted estates. As with so many issues, fundamentally the issue is a lack of housing. Despite the enormous actions taken by this government and by past actions to try and get the housing market moving, the reality is that housing delivery in this country collapsed in the wake of the 1984 Housing Act. Anyone who looks at a graph of housing delivery since that point can see that the mass exit of the state from direct delivery of housing has never come close to being replaced by the private sector, which is one of the reasons why I was very excited this week to see comments by the Secretary of State talking about the potential mass re-entry of this government into housing delivery. It is one of the very few things that can resolve this, because what we fundamentally have here is a broken market. People are forced to accept unreasonable conditions on their housing because they have no choice. And until we resolve the broken market, we're going to continue to have various forms of this forms of exploitation coming forward. The reality is developers, and there are good developers and bad developers, but they overwhelmingly will seek to minimise their costs as far as possible, whatever the impact on the communities they are creating. And if we allow poor practices to be possible within the law, then we will see poor practices being delivered by these people. We need to be mindful, of course, that regulation has an impact. As someone who has delivered local plans, I can tell you, I was always very mindful of the requirements that I was putting on developers, because I knew every single requirement I put on was an affordable house being taken out of the system. And we as legislators sometimes, I think, have been a bit careless in some of the additional requirements we've put on without them being fundamentally necessary. We have to make sure that regulation is proportionate, but in this case, it very much is. I've been dealing with the issue of unadopted estates for the better part of 2 decades now, and no worse example exists in my experience than that of Forge Wood, a neighbourhood which, despite being part of a new town which has all the services and the neighbourhood principle would deliver for a neighbourhood, unlike my other neighbourhoods in Forge Wood, they're all having to pay for it effectively a second time, once through their council tax and the second time through their unadopted or through their management agency, at a fee that effectively rivals the exact same level of council tax as the district authority. They're paying more for less services. There are questions over the nature of the contracts and the contractors brought in. And if you look at any of these property management agencies and you see the company secretaries listed, they're registered for hundreds, if not thousands, of these companies. How effective can you be when you're registered for 1,000? It's very little more than just fee farming, frankly, for my residents, for no actual benefit. If you go through the Articles of Association, as I have done, to try and find ways for residents to wrest control back, the complexities in there effectively mean these people are completely unaccountable. It's masquerading as ownership by those communities while delivering an unaccountable system. So what do we do? Well, I think the existing proposals brought forward by the government are an improvement, and I very much welcome the Select Committee's recommendation of the independent regulator, which should come into effect. But on the issue of unadopted estates, ultimately we now have to turn off the tap. We need to establish fixed conditions and fees so these are all adopted at the point in which they are completed and handed over to local authorities. We also need to establish a pathway for existing unadopted estates to be taken on by the state with a need for local authorities to be able to plan out the way in which they can bring these in. I very much believe it is possible within the existing system and with the existing financial constraints to adopt these, but you cannot do that when sending, up at the moment, we're running up a flag to tell every developer in the country to ditch their responsibility to get these sites adopted. So I'm very pleased by the recommendations before today. I'm very pleased with the government recommendations, but further action is needed on an independent regulator and on turning off the tap on unadopted estates. Thank you.
Abdissam Mohammed.